There is a painting hanging inside CIA headquarters in Langley, Virginia. Every face on those walls is American. Officers, directors, men and women who served their country and are remembered for it. Every face except one. One man who was never American, who never wore a uniform, who never swore an oath to the United States of America. A Soviet engineer born in Kazakhstan who lived his entire life inside the Soviet Union and chose in silence, in secret, at the cost of everything he had, to fight against it. His name was Adolf Tolkachev. The KGB called him a traitor. The CIA called him the most valuable spy of the Cold War. History gave him a simpler name, the billion-dollar spy. This is his story. Moscow, January 1977. The coldest kind of night. The kind where your breath hangs in the air like a ghost, and the city feels like it is holding something in, some vast, pressurized secret it cannot release. The streets near the American embassy are quiet, but never unwatched. The KGB had eyes everywhere in Moscow, on street corners, in apartments, in the hearts of neighbors who had learned that loyalty to the state was the only safe religion. It was not a city where a man could easily be something other than what he appeared to be. And yet, on one of those frozen January nights, a middle-aged man in a heavy coat approached a car with diplomatic license plates, knocked on the window, and handed something through the glass. Then he turned and walked away into the dark, and for a moment Moscow swallowed him whole, as it had swallowed so many others before him. The CIA officer behind that wheel did what the agency's paranoid doctrine demanded. He drove away. He didn't know who the man was. He didn't know what was in the envelope. He was scared. In Moscow, you were always scared. Walk-ins, Soviet citizens who approached American officers claiming to want to spy, were one of the KGB's favorite provocations. You accepted a walk-in in Moscow, and the next thing you knew, you were being expelled from the country, or worse. So the officer drove away, and Tolkachev watched the tail lights disappear. He came back. This is the part of the story that most people miss when they hear it summarized. They hear Soviet spy pass secrets to the CIA, and they imagine a man being recruited, cultivated, turned. They imagine handlers and dead drops and a CIA officer with a plan. But Tolkachev had no handler. He had no plan, not in the professional sense. What he had was something rarer and more dangerous than tradecraft. He had a reason. And for over a year, through brutal Russian winters, through KGB surveillance that never truly slept, through rejection after rejection from men who thought he was a trap, he kept showing up. 13 months of it. Car after car, window after window. This middle-aged engineer with his thick glasses and his quiet face walked up to American diplomats and handed them envelopes and watched them drive away. Because that is what this story is really about. Not radar, not fighter jets, not the $1 billion. It is about a woman named Natalia and what the Soviet state took from her before Adolf Tolkachev ever made his first move. Natalia was Tolkachev's wife. She was the daughter of a writer. In the Soviet Union in the 1930s, under Joseph Stalin, being a writer was not a profession. It was a liability. Stalin's great terror swept through Soviet intellectual life like a scythe. Writers, artists, scientists, anyone whose thoughts might be dangerous, they were arrested, tried in courts where guilt was predetermined, and killed. Or sent to the Gulag, the vast archipelago of labor camps scattered across Siberia and Central Asia, where human beings were reduced to instruments of state production until they broke and were discarded. Natalia's mother was arrested. She was executed. Her father was swept into the camps. Natalia survived. She built a life. She married Adolf Tolkachev, this quiet, brilliant electronics engineer who had carved a place for himself in the Soviet defense establishment. She carried her wound in silence, the way Soviet citizens learned to carry everything, inward, invisible, sealed. But Tolkachev saw it. He saw what the state had done to the woman he loved. He watched her live with that absence, with those two ghosts, her mother executed, her father broken, and he read the books the state forbade, Solzhenitsyn's searing accounts of the Gulag, Sakharov's dissident courage, and somewhere inside him, the grief curdled into something harder, something with an edge. He began to think about what it would mean to fight back, not with a protest sign, not with a letter, not with anything that would get him arrested the same day. He thought about what he actually had, what he could actually use, and what he had, what he could use, was access. He sat at a desk in Phazotron, one of the most classified military research institutes in the Soviet Union, and he worked on the radar systems that would go inside Soviet fighter jets. He knew things. He touched the crown jewels of Soviet military technology every single day. And one day, we don't know exactly when, we don't know what morning he woke up and made the decision, he chose to give those secrets to the enemy. The question that stayed with him for over a year was whether the enemy would take them. February 16th, 1978. CIA Moscow Station. Chief Gardner Hathaway was leaving the embassy. A man approached his car, handed him an envelope. Hathaway drove away. Later, he opened it. Inside was a letter, handwritten in careful, measured Russian, from someone who knew the names, the programs, the internal structures of Soviet military research that no outsider should have been able to know. The writer was offering to be a source, offering everything. Hathaway brought the letter back to Langley. The agency was skeptical. The agency was always skeptical, especially in Moscow, especially after the KGB had run so many provocations. But this letter was different. The specificity was too real. The knowledge was too deep. They started a careful, painstaking process of back-channel verification, notes left at dead drops, messages passed with extraordinary caution through layers of cutouts. And slowly, piece by piece, the CIA came to accept what the letter was telling them. This was real. They gave him a code name, CKSPHERE, later Jeet Vanquish. They assigned him handlers. And then the intelligence started flowing, and the men at Langley who received it began to understand they were holding something they had never held before. To understand what Tolkachev gave America, you need to understand what America did not know. In the late 1970s, the CIA and the Pentagon were flying nearly blind when it came to Soviet air defense technology. They knew the broad strokes. The Soviets had fighter jets, the Soviets had radar, the Soviets had missiles. But the specifics, the actual frequencies, the range envelopes, the countermeasure vulnerabilities, the precise capabilities that a Soviet pilot had when he climbed into a MiG-29 and went looking for an American aircraft? Those details were locked inside classified institutes in Moscow and Leningrad and Zhukovsky, guarded by the full weight of the Soviet security state. American military planners were designing their aircraft, their tactics, their entire air combat doctrine against an enemy they couldn't fully see. Tolkachev showed them everything. He had been given a miniature Pentax camera, small enough to conceal in the palm of a hand, in a coat pocket, in the lining of a briefcase. Night after night, staying late in his office, working alone in the classified stacks of Phazotron, he photographed documents, technical manuals, engineering blueprints, developmental reports on systems that hadn't even entered production yet. The radar schematics for the MiG-29, the radar schematics for the MiG-31, whose passive phased array radar the US considered the most advanced airborne radar in the world, the Su-27. Every major Soviet fighter aircraft of the 1980s, the planes that would have been the front line of any air war over Europe, the planes that American pilots would have faced in combat, Tolkachev photographed their eyes, their sensor suites, their kill capabilities. He documented the R-23 missile, the R-24, the R-27, the R-33 and the R-60, the air-to-air weapons that Soviet pilots would use to bring down American aircraft. He pulled apart, on film, the S-300 missile system, the most advanced Soviet surface-to-air defense in existence at the time, and then he walked it all out of the building in his coat pocket. The CIA translators at Langley could barely keep up. The volume of material was so immense, so technically dense, that the agency's analysts were still working through Tolkachev's documents years after his arrest. 21 face-to-face meetings across 7 years, over 100 rolls of film, tens of thousands of pages of classified Soviet intelligence, and among all of it, perhaps the single most consequential revelation of the entire operation: Soviet fighters possessed look-down, shoot-down radar. They could detect aircraft flying below them, a capability American planners had not confirmed and had not fully accounted for in their war planning. That single fact rewrote American air combat tactics overnight. It changed the low-altitude ingress routes NATO pilots were trained to fly. It changed what American aircraft needed in their electronic warfare suites to survive. The U.S. Air Force would eventually calculate that Tolkachev's intelligence saved America approximately $2 billion in research and development. But that number is almost beside the point, because what he actually gave America was not a number. It was an edge. It was the ability to build countermeasures specifically designed to defeat the radars he had exposed. His information triggered a complete redesign of the electronics package aboard the F-15 Eagle. American pilots went to the skies of the 1980s with invisible armor that the Soviets didn't know had been forged from their own blueprints. His intelligence remained actionable long after his death, flying in American jets through the Gulf War, over Iraq, over Yugoslavia. Pilots who never knew his name flew safer because of what he had carried out of a building in his coat pocket. The CIA handlers who worked with Tolkachev described the experience in terms that carry a particular weight. Running a spy in Moscow was unlike running a spy anywhere else in the world. CIA officers posted to the Moscow station were followed everywhere, every day, by teams of KGB officers who rotated in shifts, who memorized their faces and their habits and their cars, who sat in vehicles outside their apartment buildings and watched them come and go. To meet Tolkachev face-to-face, a CIA officer had to execute what the agency called a surveillance detection route, a multi-hour walk through Moscow designed to confirm that every single KGB tale had been shed. This was not a brisk jog around the block. This was hours of riding trams, doubling back through metro stations, entering buildings and exiting through different doors, standing in shop windows pretending to look at merchandise while watching reflections in the glass for the familiar face that appeared too many times. Get it wrong, and you burned your career, or you burned your agent, or you ended up interrogated inside the Lubyanka, the KGB's fortress in the center of Moscow that had swallowed so many and released so few. One of Tolkachev's handlers was Bill Plunkett, a former Navy pilot who stood well over 6 feet tall, not the easiest profile to lose in a Moscow crowd. On a cold December evening in 1982, Plunkett and his wife left the embassy with the station chief and his wife, apparently heading somewhere social. In the back seat, the women were balancing what appeared to be a large birthday cake. The KGB surveillance team fell in dutifully behind them. What happened next was the result of weeks of planning, a careful choreography of turns and stops and moments where the tail was broken, and Plunkett emerged somewhere in Moscow's grey winter streets to keep his appointment with a man the Soviets would very much have liked to find. Tolkachev came. They met. The material changed hands, and Tolkachev walked back into the city that would eventually kill him. In return for what he gave the United States, Tolkachev asked for very little. He accumulated a substantial account of rubles held by the CIA, money he could never spend without triggering exactly the kind of suspicion that would destroy him. He asked for Western music, the Beatles, Led Zeppelin. He asked for a Sony Walkman, and he said it was for his son, Oleg, though there was something in the asking that suggested it was also for himself. A small piece of the world beyond the wall. Something to listen to in the quiet hours. He read forbidden books passed to him by the CIA. He asked questions about life in the West with the hunger of a man who had been in a sealed room his entire life and was pressing his face against a crack in the wall. And he asked for a suicide pill. This request troubled Tolkachev's handlers more than almost anything else about the operation. The CIA debated it internally for months. The ethics were complicated. The precedent was complicated. Giving a spy the means to kill himself was not something the agency did casually, but Tolkachev was not being casual. He had grown up in Stalin's Soviet Union. He had watched what the state did to people it considered enemies. He had watched it up close, in his own family. He knew what the KGB did to traitors. He knew about the interrogation rooms and the isolation and the long procedural dismantling of a human being that preceded a bullet to the back of the head in some basement in Moscow. He wanted a choice. He wanted the ability to deny them the last word. Whether the CIA ultimately gave him that pill is still classified. What is known is that when the end came, he did not have the chance to use it. In January 1981, a young CIA officer named Edward Lee Howard was hired into the agency's Directorate of Operations. On paper, he was exactly what the CIA wanted: trilingual, a master's degree, a former Peace Corps volunteer. His father was an Air Force electronics specialist who had worked on guided missiles in Europe. Howard was sent to the farm, the CIA's secret training facility at Camp Peary, Virginia, where instructors drilled him in the arts of tradecraft, asset recruitment, dead drops, counter-surveillance, evasion. Instructors noted, as a passing detail, that Howard showed a particular gift for counter-surveillance. It would matter later in ways no one intended. Howard was being groomed for Moscow. The CIA's most critical posting, the most dangerous station in the world. As part of his preparation, he was briefed extensively on the agency's most sensitive ongoing Moscow operations, including the identity of the man codenamed CKSPHERE, including Tolkachev's real name, his methods, his dead drops, his routines, the complete architecture of the most valuable human intelligence operation the CIA had running anywhere in the world. Howard was being handed the keys to the kingdom. Then, in the spring of 1983, on the eve of his Moscow posting, Howard failed his polygraph. Not on questions about loyalty, on questions about past drug use, petty theft, and personal conduct. The CIA faced a reckoning. They had given a man with apparent behavioral problems access to their most sensitive secrets, and now they had to decide what to do. What they did was fire him. On May 2, 1983, Edward Lee Howard was escorted out of CIA headquarters and sent home to Santa Fe, New Mexico. The agency did not arrest him, did not conduct a thorough damage assessment, did not inform the FBI in any meaningful way. They handed him his termination notice and moved on. It was one of the most catastrophic decisions in the history of American intelligence. Howard was not the kind of man who simply moved on. He was bitter. He was humiliated. He was furious at the agency that had trained him, trusted him with its most sensitive secrets, rewired his mind for espionage, and then thrown him out over a polygraph. He began drinking heavily. In February 1984, he was arrested after brandishing a pistol at men in a bar in downtown Santa Fe. His personal life was fraying at the edges. And somewhere in that darkness in 1984, while visiting Austria, he made contact with Soviet intelligence. He sold them what he knew. He sold them names, methods, dead drops, identities. He sold them everything the CIA had shown him to prepare him for a posting he never got. The price, reportedly, was $6,000. $6,000 for secrets that would help point the KGB toward the most valuable intelligence operation the United States had ever run inside Soviet territory. But Howard was not acting alone in Tolkachev's destruction. In April 1985, just weeks before the KGB moved, Aldrich Ames, a CIA counterintelligence analyst with direct access to Moscow station assets, began selling names to the KGB in what would become one of the most devastating penetrations in American intelligence history. Ames handed over the identities of multiple CIA sources operating inside the Soviet Union. Tolkachev was among them. 2 traitors, 2 separate betrayals, both pointing from different directions toward the same man. In June 1985, Adolf Tolkachev was returning to Moscow from a dacha, a countryside retreat, when the KGB's Alpha Group, the elite special operations unit that answered directly to Lubyanka, moved in. The arrest was led by KGB Lieutenant Colonel Vladimir Zaitsev. Tolkachev was taken. That same day, his CIA handler Paul Stombor attempted to make contact and was arrested at a dead drop location, where the KGB had positioned themselves in waiting. Stombor was hauled to the Lubyanka and interrogated. Spy equipment was seized. He was subsequently expelled from the Soviet Union. But here is the detail that makes the KGB's operation complete and makes this story even darker than it appears. The Soviets did not announce Tolkachev's arrest. Not for 10 months. They kept it secret. For nearly a year, the KGB fed the CIA false information through channels they now controlled, using Tolkachev's compromised identity as a weapon against the very agency he had served. The CIA did not know what had happened to him. The station in Moscow was still operating on the assumption that their most valuable asset might somehow be reachable. It was not until September 1985 that TASS finally announced, in bloodless bureaucratic language, that a staff member at one of Moscow's research institutes had been arrested for passing secret materials to the United States. The Washington Post named him publicly as one of the CIA's most valuable human assets in the Soviet Union. Inside Moscow, behind walls no Western journalist would penetrate, Tolkachev had already been interrogated, tried and convicted of high treason. Meanwhile, Howard had not waited to be caught. In September 1985, after the FBI finally put a surveillance team on his house in Santa Fe, Howard noticed them. On the night of September 21st, using a technique called a jack-in-the-box, a dummy propped in the passenger seat on a spring mechanism, Howard tumbled out of the slow-moving car in the dark and vanished. The FBI watched what they thought was 2 people in the car for miles before realizing they were following a decoy. Howard flew to Helsinki, then to Vienna, then to Moscow, where he spent the rest of his life as a protected Soviet defector, the first former CIA officer ever to seek asylum in the Soviet Union. He had gotten away clean. Tolkachev would not. September 24, 1986. Adolf Georgievich Tolkachev, 59 years old, was executed by shooting. The following day, a Politburo document recorded that the sentence had been carried out the day before. In October, TASS confirmed it officially. A brief paragraph, no detail. The machinery of the Soviet state disposing of a man who had dared to oppose it. Natalia, his wife, the woman whose mother had been executed by this same state, whose father had been sent to die in its camps, did not simply receive the news of her husband's execution from a distance. She was arrested, charged with supporting high treason, sentenced to 3 years in prison. The state that had already destroyed her family across 2 generations now came for what remained of it. She had known nothing of what Tolkachev was doing. He had spent years carefully compartmentalizing his work from his family, protecting them from the knowledge that might destroy them. But Soviet justice did not require knowledge. It required a name. His son Oleg, for whom Tolkachev had once asked for a Walkman, would go on to rebuild his life in the new Russia, eventually becoming a prominent architect. Tolkachev had protected him, had kept the walls between the spy work and the family tight enough that Oleg survived. That too was part of the tradecraft. That too was a kind of love. After the Cold War ended and the Soviet Union collapsed, the CIA began to formally assess what Adolf Tolkachev had meant. $2 billion in research and development savings was the conservative military estimate, but the number is almost an insult to the reality of it, because Tolkachev had not just saved America money, he had handed it an asymmetric advantage in air combat that the Soviets never knew they had surrendered. The radar countermeasures built from his documents flew in American jets through the Gulf War. The same intelligence that he had photographed in a classified Moscow building in the early 1980s was still being applied, still being translated, still shaping American military capability years after his execution. Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist David Hoffman spent years obtaining declassified CIA documents and interviewing participants to reconstruct the full story, published in his 2015 book, The $1 Billion Spy. It was through Hoffman's work that the full human dimensions of the operation became publicly known. Not just the intelligence value, but the texture of it. The forbidden books, the Western music, the Sony Walkman, the suicide pill that may or may not have been given, and the portrait, because there is still the portrait. It hangs inside CIA headquarters in Langley, Virginia, painted by Kathy Krantz-Fieramoska. It shows a Soviet engineer in glasses, not a general. Not a defector with a dramatic escape story, not a man who made it out alive, a man who stayed in the hardest city in the world for a spy operation, who kept his secret for 7 years while sitting next to colleagues who had no idea, who photographed documents in the dark and walked through checkpoints and went home to his wife and his son and ate dinner and slept and woke up and did it again. For 7 years, he never asked to be saved. He never asked to be extracted. He never ran. He chose to stay in the beast's throat, because leaving would have meant abandoning the only thing that made his life feel like resistance rather than submission. And eventually the beast swallowed him, as beasts always do. But before it did, one quiet engineer with a miniature camera and a coat pocket and a wound that never healed changed the balance of the Cold War. And in Langley, in the building where America keeps its most important ghosts, his face still watches from the wall. Adolf Tolkachev, the $1 billion spy, the only Soviet citizen who earned a place there.